Blessings BookTube, here today to talk to you about We Need New Names by NOVIOLET Bulawayo. NOVIOLET Bulawayo is a nom de plume. Her given name at birth was, I want to say Elizabeth for the Western name, Zadine, something like that, Zadil. And then Tsele, I want to say, is the family name. And the nom de plume is taken from NOVIOLET, which is honoring a family member of hers, and Bulawayo, the second city of Zimbabwe. So the first thing we're invited to look at with this right away, right, is the names. And also, I would say the name calling. So we've got names of her friends are like Bastard, Mother Love, God Knows, the Darling, of course, our main character, Born Free. Place names are also interesting. They live in the slum of paradise, a little ironically, after their original homes, nicer homes, were bulldozed over politics. And then she ends up, when she goes to the States in the second part, in destroyed Michigan, which is very apt. But yeah, so these are just a few of the names that these kids are calling each other, mainly in Africa and a little bit later in destroyed Michigan. Dog shit, goat teeth, chapped buttocks, fat man, bread devil, dumb donkey, egghead, shard of glass, cockamouth, sellout, big head, cantankerous idiot, biological blunder, and fatal miscalculation, and nonsense people. All right, so the first question that I was asking myself with this, as these kids were running around stealing guavas and tormenting security guards. Security guard is a fascinating character and job today in Africa, somewhere between the neo-colonial and the globalization. These people are trapped in that job against their own people. So anyway, getting back to these names. Are these names denigrations, terms of endearment? Both, neither. I think I'm settling more or less for many of them on both. Now, there is a tradition in some cultures of naming someone something unpleasant in order that the spirits or other forces not be attracted to them or not pay attention to them because, oh, that's yucky. So like as a form of protection. But I didn't read anything in this or haven't heard anything about it being the case here. So I don't think that is the case. I just think it's a case of like claiming, Octavio Paz talks a lot about this in Labyrinth of Solitude, about the Mexicans as, jodido, as fucked, chingado. There's almost taking a pride in it, right? Like the Yankees come to, knock us down. Everyone comes to knock us down. And then you take a sense of pride in that. Just the way that certain ethnic groups have claimed, horrible slurs that we put on them as, identity markers for their own group, like the N-word. All right, so there's that. For the most part, then, I had a few other things like the guard character to discuss, but I think I'm just going to stick to more or less the discussion questions that are in the book, and I'm going to leave out. I was thinking of putting this as a vlog, like I did with the last African novel I read, which kind of gives me permission to talk more about my own personal experiences. But while that was set in the Sudan, and I had also lived in the Sudan, albeit on the other side, this is the whole other side of Africa. So I think I want to put my own experiences more or less in parentheses. I was in a rural village, a couple hundred families. I did work in the city with a homeless youth group. And I've had some other experiences, like cousinage, joking cousins is apropos here. Well, I'll tell you about joking cousins, and then I'll try to take myself out of the picture. So joking cousins is this idea in Mali, where I served as Peace Corps, that in Africa there are a great number of taboos in Africa. In Mali, there are a great number of taboos. In many cultures, there's a great number of taboos. So, for example, if a woman is pregnant, you must never mention that she's pregnant. God forbid something happened to that baby, right? But with your joking cousin, which could be an ethnic group or it could be a caste, for instance, black Smiths can't marry Traorés or Dogons, have to respect Bozos. These kinds of interactions end up alleviating the stress between ethnic groups. I think this is true because the only group that was taking arms in Mali at that time, before the Islamic fundamentalist stuff entered, was the Tuareg group, and they're the only group that aren't in the cousinage system. Even though other nomadic groups like the Fulani, they're nomadic, but they were included. Other groups, a proud northern group like the Saurai, also proud northern group, they were in the joking cousin thing as well. So if you're a joking cousin, you shouldn't have any rapport of blood. So no marriage, but also no spilling of blood. And then with the taboos, everything's out. You could go to the pregnant lady, hey, spit that baby out. Let's throw him on the grill, whatever. Craziness. So I don't know if that applies to these names in this case, this sort of endearment or not. But I have so much more I could say about my experiences in Africa that I'm going to try to leave out to not make this a vlog, but make it a book discussion. So let's jump into the questions here, and maybe I'll weave some of that stuff in. So the first question is that at the opening of We Need New Names, Darling's living in a close-knit community of extended family members and friends. And when she moves to Detroit, she lives in a smaller family unit, and perhaps a more conventional one. Does living with fewer people give Darling a more intimate family life? Was her life in Zimbabwe more supportive and affirming for her? What are the advantages to living in a larger, more open community like the one she was born into in Zimbabwe? Is it possible for that kind of family structure to be recreated in the United States? Many things I'd like to say about that. I was dreading the second part of the book when she went to the States. They always let me down. And I was so enjoying her relations in Africa, even though some of it's quite horrible. They're going to, at one point, try to, give a girl an abortion. They have no idea what they're doing. Yes, horrible stuff happens in the first half of the book, but there is, as I said, that resiliency. What do they call it in babies? They got bendy bones, right, that can bounce. But anyway, when it goes to the States, I was relieved. It was very interesting and well done, I think. But what I found interesting with relation to this question is that it's a very similar. Now, you could argue that her life in the States is, she makes friends with another immigrant from West Africa and with a local African American. There's some funny stuff with Ebonics there as well. She has a group of friends in the States as well. Eventually, one could argue that they get up to equally dicey stuff, right? Like there's their relationship with pornography. They steal a car at one point. So there's some mischief in both places, but there's also this sort of innocence of childhood in both places. So I really, really enjoyed that. But I will say one big difference that happens in real life, because I also worked resettling among other Bantu, Somali Bantu refugees in South Carolina, there comes to be this sort of reversal from African values. Again, I say African. I don't know most of Africa, but the parts of Africa I know, and I think this might be generalizable to a lot of the continent, is there's a great respect for elders, right? Arguably, the West is a very teenage culture. We're all about the kids, give the kids everything, spoil the heck out of the kids. Oh, what could go wrong? Ruin the planet. But there in Africa, it's like the elders are everything. And your parents gave you life, and they could take it away. So, in Mali, you could tell any kid, hey, you, come here, run this errand for me. And off they go, and they'll do it. And yeah, arguably, they would get hit if they misbehaved, but it just doesn't happen. Kids just wouldn't talk back or, give grief in that way. For the vast most part, when the culture's intact. When it starts to fall apart from colonization or border towns or gold mining, then of course those things, become strained. But in the States, we're already a youth culture, and then what happens with immigrants is they end up. I remember this one time a social worker came in to this family I was working with. The girl was cutting meat. She had the knife between her toes, and she was sort of pulling the meat across the knife, sitting straight-legged on the floor, which I understand, to this social worker looked insane, unhygienic, dangerous. But that's a way of cutting meat that makes a huge amount of sense if you don't have a table, right? And possibly your knife is very dull, etc. So they were horrified. But anyway, you have these little misunderstandings. But what happens is, instead of dealing with the adults, because the kids learn the English much quicker, they're in school and whatnot, the adults typically, even if they have qualifications, are working in jobs where they don't use their English a great deal, maybe possibly, production jobs or certain service jobs. Anyway, the kids end up with more sophisticated English, and so they're constantly translating through the kids. So there's this valorization of the youth over the elders, which must be very insulting, confusing, frustrating, for the elders. Probably not just African refugees, probably most refugees that come from a culture that honors the elders. All right, that's everything I have to say about the move to Detroit. Whether it's possible to have a more intimate family structure. Well, is it more intimate? There's just the auntie, the uncle, who's he's my favorite. He's Ghanaian, and then their son, or his son, goes off to war. The father falls apart and gets drunk, becomes a drunk, and they divorce. So the intimate family becomes a broken up family, whereas in Africa you don't have the extended family. So there's all kinds of relationships that are involved there. So like in Mali, if a woman would become widowed, then the next older brother in the family should, marry her if they're available. There's just, it's sort of always, there's a safety net, familial safety net to make sure people aren't isolated and left out. And so I would argue that the intimacy, if anything, is probably stronger in intact traditional African cultures, the little that I know. When Darling is living in America, she Skypes with Chipo, who tells her that she can't refer to Zimbabwe as her country anymore. Do you think this is fair? Is Darling entitled to a sense of ownership of a place she has left behind? Darling is 1,000,000% entitled to a sense of ownership of any culture she chooses to claim at any given time, and to change that attitude. However, she can't dictate how others view that. And this is a huge problem because, in effect, people become almost stateless. They've left one place, so they're not truly of that place in some sense, right? Like I live abroad, and so, in what meaningful way am I American when I'm abroad? People might see me that way, but there's certainly something missing. Can't go to the Waffle House. Well, I say that with globalization, there'll probably be a Waffle House on the corner in a minute. And then they're not always very well received in their host cultures either, right? Even I think generous cultures like maybe Scandinavians, I think, are quite generous in taking up their share of refugees and whatnot. But that's a very homogenous, not to say quite white culture. So there must be like this interesting disconnect. But in many times, the receiving nations are the ancient colonial nations. Like no one from India is ever going to look for this tiny island of England if the England hadn't gone there first, right? Or Indonesians to the Netherlands or whatever. So they sort of reap what they sow, right? Even the Turks in Germany, they were invited as guest workers. The Mexicans in America were invited at one point as braceros. All right, so that's a very painful scene where her friend tells her like, you're not us anymore, basically, and that's one of her best friends. But her best friend's, entitled to whatever feelings she might be having stuck back in Zimbabwe, seeing all her friends emigrate. She had a child quite young. And there's also a sense that, they're kids. There is a little bit that Darlie has forgotten her friends a bit. And even her mom at one point calls and she's like, don't you know the voice of your own mother? When do you don't, like, complaining that she doesn't talk to her enough. That's hard. That's a hard one for those of us who live between cultures and countries to navigate. 3 says, let alone a young girl like vulnerable, refugee type situation like Darlie. 3, although it's not specified how exactly Darling is able to move to Detroit. Is it specified that it's as a refugee or a family resettlement, family reintegration? I'm not sure exactly how she comes. How do NOVIOLET Bulawayo's descriptions of Zimbabwe diverge from other portrayals of Africa? Does her method of depicting tragedy make the harrowing elements more or less painful for the reader? How does Darling's voice contribute to that picture? Whereas in a lot of what I'd like to call the trauma narratives of the early wave of translated fiction, thinking like Kite Runners with the horrible, child rape scene and things like that. They become, I want to say, dominated or tainted the whole sort of book by the trauma, and so therefore it makes it easy for people to talk about these places only in terms of misery. Whereas, how many trauma narratives do we have from the United States? But you have other works of art from the United States, Hollywood, right? Happy ending, counterbalancing that. Whereas you just have this one book from Afghanistan and this happens, and so everyone thinks, oh, look how awful it is over there. In this case, I think that all of the awful things that are happening are contextualized within this sort of plucky, I'm not happy-go-lucky, but, very vibrant, Zimbabwean culture with humor and songs and games. And so I think that it gives that right balance. Just the way no one ever talks about Native American humor, but Indians are always talking about Indian humor. But we have this stone-faced vision of them, right? Like I'm picturing their FBI T-shirts with the fry bread inspector or Homeland Security since 1462 or whatever. Anyway, okay. 4, what role can literature play in how we understand other cultures? That is a huge philosophical question that I'm not going to, all of my videos are talking about that. I don't want to take a long time to talk about that in terms of this work. I want to talk more about the specifics of this work. 5 says, despite their living in poverty in Zimbabwe, lots of American pop culture makes its way into the imagination of Darling and her friends. From Beyonce to McDonald's to ER, TV show ER. Did this surprise you, and how are her ideas about American pop culture affirmed or challenged when she arrives in Detroit? Well, it doesn't surprise me, of course, because of globalization. Although I was in Africa pre-cell phone, So there has to have been just an explosion of exposure. There's still not electricity in half these places, but they see these images. And some of the first images they see are porn. And so there's this vision. I mean, that's your comeuppance, the West. You can view these foreign cultures as just beds of trauma, and they can view you as a bunch of, sex obsessed, whatever. So porn skews things, all that stuff. How is it challenged? Well, there's that problem, right, of the American dream. I don't think these kids, I'm not sure. The American dream is very different in different places. The American dream that an Asian person might have towards the States, or a European, or an African. And also, not everyone is focused on the States in some places that were colonized. So the pull of England might be stronger than the States, or the pull of France, for example. Just to pick two big ones in Africa. Always if you do come to the States with the American dream mentality, always there's a disappointment, and there's a reluctance. There's a really strong, strange reluctance for people to tell the truth back home about the lie of the American dream. And I'm not sure why. I've asked people, I've thought about it a long time, but the information doesn't get back that, hey, it's not quite what you were picturing. And it makes a big difference, too, if you're going somewhere, going to come, as we say, yalla yalla. So if you're going to go right to the States, bank a bunch of money, go back to Mexico, build your home in Mexico, that's a very different experience than if you go, and then your wife also comes, or your kids also come, or you have kids in the States, or you have other family who's living legally in the States. You're coming to stay. And I think that's more the expectation with Darling, that she's going to have this life, right? And that's painful because they can't go back to their home, so in many cases due to laws and money, to visit, or even for parents' funerals. That's another really tragic thing about the experience of people who they're somewhere in between, right? They're somewhere in between a voluntary migrant and they're not enslaved to the States, but they sort of have to, in some way, emigrate. And so there's a different, relationship to that. All right, the scene with the NGO worker. She's taking pictures of them. They're embarrassed. Their clothes are all ripped or whatever. They're going to get gifts. That's a very realistic scene that does happen. I don't have too much really more to add about that. Title the book refers to the choice that many immigrants make to give their children names that, as Darling said, make them belong in America. How important is a name? Oh, I did want to say one more thing about one of the names. What was it? Born Free. NOVIOLET is of the Born Free generation. This is the generation after independence and before Mugabe, I want to say, before the dictator. So her experience is very different from the kids she's depicting. She talks about that in the interviews, because they are very much of the bulldozed generation, right? I mean, you can see they weren't required to exile themselves, but when your country bulldozes your house, you're getting a strong vibe of hey, maybe I'm not welcome here. In what way does America change Darling's personality? Is America the reason for this shift, or is it Darling herself? Well, each individual negotiates their enculturement in their own ways. Certainly, there are certain structures that canalize or funnel those experiences in some ways. So, if you're going to public school in the States, so there's a big variety of public schools in the States already, But there's this kind of schooling experience that if you come as a child, you're going to be going through, which in some ways sort of tells you about the state that you've joined, the state of the United States. So let's say you're going to a school and you're being horribly bullied, right? Or you're the only black kid, and you're essentialized, or you're asked to represent, or othered, or however that goes for you. I think she's a bit lucky in Detroit's quite a black city. There are other immigrant kids for her to interact with. So it could have been a much worse school situation for her. Also, the family situation that she enters is obviously her auntie. That's family. She's her auntie's very together person. The uncle, until the end there, he's also a really together person, hardworking, stable. So there's a family continuity, right? And I think that's bigger than anything else. Bigger than culture in some ways, bigger than, well, I won't say bigger than economics, because they can crush you with economics and culture. But given a fair shot, if you've got some sort of intact family structure, I think you've got a real chance at having a successful, happy life. And she has this in Africa, and although her father is off, that's a horrible story, comes home to die with AIDS, which they keep it hidden. So there is some sort of stressors on the families in both Africa and the States. But anyway, there's also some supports that Darling has. And she's a lively, spunky kid on her own as well. So let's not take anything away from her. How might the reading experience have been different if the novel was written in Darling's voice? Hadn't been written in Darling's voice. What did her voice bring? Bulawayo's prose is also full of deliberate misspellings of phonetic language, like Destroyed Michigan. What do those choices reveal about Darling's experiences? Everything hinges on Darling's perspective. I think without Darling's perspective, if you just have the NGO worker, right, as the POV character, all of those scenes, even the innocent games, let alone the abortion scene, the most innocent of games, find bin Laden or whatever, becomes sinister. Kind of like that, the way that a social worker viewed that very simple thing of the girl cutting the meat, right, as she would have done in her family back home. So yeah, that view is essential, right? I spoke once at a conference in I think it was the University of South Carolina, a transnational feminism conference, and somehow we ended up talking about teen pregnancy. Would this have been at UNM? Sorry, I think this was at UNM. Anyway, I don't remember where it was, but we were talking about the Navajo and how teen pregnancy, viewed from the American, policy perspective, it's this horrible thing. Kids drop out of school, they have terrible outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas for, in the context of the Navajo Nation, you're considered an adult at the age when you're able to have children. Therefore, you're instructed into the ways of being an adult at that age, at that time when it's appropriate. Therefore, you can have a child. You are considered prepared to have children. If you are still in school, you finish your schooling because you've got this extended family helping you, supporting you, and expecting you to still do your adult responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the same phenomenon, teen pregnancy, right? But it's viewed from the lens of the Navajo Nation versus the United States. Totally different. So I think everything here